Hello and welcome back. My name is Sean Shaw and this is Vanguards of Democracy. Today's guests have found their own path to fighting for the justice of others, one through education and the other through the court system. Attorney Karly Christine will be calling in to provide some insight on what counts as personal injury in the eyes of the law and how to recognize the situations where your damages might be recoverable. But first, I'm here with Dr. Sam Wright to delve into his efforts to teach history as the backbone of social activism today. That interview starts right now, so stay tuned. Welcome to another episode of Vanguards of Democracy. This is Sean Shaw, and I've got a special guest in the building here, even though he's got a red jacket on. I'm gonna let him. Ain't nobody telling the world that nail you up in this podcast. But Dr. Wright, I appreciate you joining us today, even if you got that Cap Alpha Psi jacket on. We allow for such things in this studio. But man, Dr. Wright, first of all, I appreciate you joining us today. You've done a lot of everything. You're one of those people that has the life experience, has touched a whole lot of areas. And I was just happy that we were able to get you as a guest. First thing I want to talk about really, just maybe even chronology, is just tell me your background and how you got to kind of where you are right now, just your journey, a little bit of your story for those that don't know it. And then I want to talk about some specific stuff.
Well, let me say that my upbringing was somewhat humble, and from a little sleepy little community, Boynton Beach. My parents were both reared there, born and reared in Boynton Beach. And my mother was Bahamian ancestry. Daddy is from, his family's from Georgia, but he was born in Boynton. And they were real adamant that, we try to go to school and do well. I had a grandmother who did all of the training of my skills of my singing and my speaking and oratory. She kind of helped me with those kind of skills. I was a church-going fella, loved the Lord and enjoyed church, and I did singing. Participated in integrating a predominantly white junior high school during that time, and then, of course, went on to the high school. So I got a chance to meet and mingle with a lot of different people. Had an uncle who loved to party. And my uncle was a butler and had all of the friends who traveled from up north. So they would come down and they would come over to my aunt's house. My aunt was a FAMU graduate, and they would bring all kind of goodies. They would drive Rolls Royces over to the house. So, as a young man, I was exposed to people with, they weren't their Rolls Royces, but there was a Rolls Royces of the Europeans that they worked for on the beach. And so they had a lot of exposure. And we sort of, like I said, came from meager beginnings, but had exposure. So I didn't really know we were really low income until I went to the University of Florida when they said I qualified for the Student Support Services program, because my parents always worked, but they weren't college educated. My father never finished high school, but global in the sense that he could talk about anything. Right now, my father's deceased now, but even at this juncture in my life, 6 to 8 with the earned doctorate, I can't hold discussions my father held because he traveled and was in the military and could talk about everything. He read the newspaper from cover to cover, and it was good being in a family like that. So they had high expectations of us, and I think that's what really motivated me with church and seeing people who were doing well. My father was a painter, very skillful, but I knew I didn't want to use my hands. I wanted to be able to use my head and my pen. And that motivated me to stay in school and to do well, even through the rough times. And we had some rough times. Life for me has not been a crystal staff. My father was somewhat abusive to the family when I was a kid coming up. He had a father who died when he was about 2 years of age. So he never had a father figure. And so he said things weren't like he really wanted them to be. His mother never really worked because she was kind of ill here and there, and the boys took care of her, but he felt he was slighted. So I think with that, coming up like that, I think he was a person who couldn't manage his anger. So he would be a very angry person with my mother, and it was some real unsettling times when I was a kid. I didn't know where I was going to end up, to tell you the truth, because of the situation of coming up in that kind of fear. But God is a good God. We continued to pray, and He worked all kind of things out. My parents lived to be in their 80s. They were married about 61 years and became like brothers and sisters. So the Lord worked out a lot of that frustration and anger and malice that my father had. And that was the real dark side of my life, coming up as a kid. But otherwise, I enjoyed school. I had phenomenal experiences, participated in band. I wanted to go to Boys State when I was in ninth grade, and my civic teacher didn't recommend me. So I was really annoyed with her about that. But what she did do for the Youth and Government Day in city government, she allowed me to be a city councilman for the day. And that really motivated me and opened my eyes to what may be possible politically. So when I returned from the University of Florida and went back to Boynton Beach, I started getting involved in a city board. And then I had residents to come ask me. They said, one fella now, he's Mr. Matthews, he's deceased, he was an alpha. He said, if anybody can run for public office in this community and win, it's you. I said, are you sure about that? He said, I am positive if you were to seek office for city council, I believe you'll win it. And lo and behold, I tried it. I jumped out there, and the first time I made the runoff, I was the first black to make the runoff in the city's history back in 1979. And so the next year, they had several seats available, 3. And I decided to put my hat in the ring. I hadn't even discussed that with my family. I just went to sit out a hall and pull my petition, and I decided I'd run again. And I worked my butt off to try to get elected. I was motivated too to the extent that many of the residents in Boynton Beach, many of whom were sick, they could barely get around when I decided to file a run for office. They all did what they could to support my candidacy. And I had a black and white team. I had a co-chairs of my campaign committee, and both of them are deceased now, I believe. But the most recent one was a retired colonel, William Condry. He died just a couple of years ago, and it was exciting. I didn't get a chance to get to his funeral services, but he knew that was a real feat, that he could help get a first black person elected. So that was a part of his obituary that his family wrote, that he was able to help chair my campaign. And it was nice. I had an attorney who was nice, who gave me an office pro bono downtown, right off of Ocean Avenue. And we worked like mad. I had sisters who really worked to help me campaign, and I had nieces and nephews particularly, who canvassed with me. I mean, I canvassed neighborhoods. I didn't really, candidates, are withdrawn in a lot of ways. That you've had experience of being a public office holder. And sometimes you don't have the mindset and the energy and enthusiasm to get out and knock on doors. But my sister said to me repeatedly, it's time to go. So we would go to Leisureville and other neighborhoods like that where I can get my literature out. And then I had calls toward the close to the election date, from people in Boynton I least expected to hear from. And they said to me, this is your time. We believe you have this election taken care of. And lo and behold, I won it. And then I ran for re-election and won again. So I served a number of 4 years on Boynton City Council, which was a real phenomenal experience as a young man. I was in my 20s when I was elected to public office. It opened my eyes a lot. What I did learn is that you don't take campaign contributions if you can't put them on your report.
Yeah.
you definitely stay away from that. Yep. So what I do now, even as a senior citizen, and when I talk with candidates about their office, about running for office, I try to give them a little lesson of things not to do, and based on some of my experiences coming up in the city of Boynton Beach and being elected to public office. And then what I did do when I was in Boynton, I traveled to neighboring cities like Pahokee and Belglade, Riviera Beach, and shared my experiences with all of those young people running for office and helped to get some of them elected to public office. Yeah, so it was been a great experience. And so when I was in Boynton Beach in politics, you wouldn't believe this, Sean, but I had so many people to say, well, we know perhaps you're preparing for the next step, and maybe county commission or state house. And I said, well, I'm not sure about all of that. So what I did, I quit my job in county government. I worked for Community Action for 10 years, and I really enjoyed working and helping the poor. Had a great boss, Maud Ford Lee, who was a FAMU graduate. Her husband, Percy Lee, was a frat brother of mine. He was a FAMU graduate. He was Urban League president. And they really cared about humanity. Oh, my God. And they worked like mad with me when I even ran for office to do what I could. You know, Percy, I have fun memories of Percy Lee getting fish, a garbage can of fish from his friends to help me sell fish in my hometown to raise money. That's what I did for my
politics
campaign.
is amazing story. We were talking off camera about some of the problems and the bad parts of it. That's some of the good things. The friends you make that you didn't have.
Listen, we sat on the corners on Friday nights in front of a young lady in Boynton Beach. She was older lady, of course, but she allowed us to use her front parking area. Mm-hmm. And we fried more fish than I've ever seen in my life. Right. And then I had a fraternity brother who owned a grocery store down in Delray Beach. And he would clean it for me. But I mean, a garbage can full of fish. And that's how I raised a lot of money for my campaign of selling fish. But I had wonderful role models. I worked with a lot of elderly, older people, I guess I should say, when I was working for county government. Because they would meet on Saturdays at Gaines Park and West Palm Beach and talk about issues in the community. And they were like all maybe 50, 55, 60, and you had this little 20-year-old fella sitting there listening to what they were talking about, and that's how I learned a lot about what was going on in the community. So that was my upbringing, and I had fun memories of my experiences in county government. But I just knew with what job I was doing, and I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. So I decided to quit, and that's when I moved to Tampa to get married to a young lady, a sweetheart, college sweetheart from the University of Florida. And of course, I started work at USF. And I always wanted a doctorate, so it was a really great experience to work at USF. So I really enjoyed that. So a lot of people know about that. A lot of people didn't know all the stuff you just said. That's what was amazing about that, Doc. Talk about the founding of the festival. Talk about your time at USF, and really, I know a lot of people be interested in. USF gets a lot of heat for what they do and don't do in the Black community here in Tampa, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective from then to now. Okay. Well, let me say that I had an interest in higher education. That's why I got a master's from the University of Florida. Before I left there, I went undergrad and got a master's. And so I didn't realize I was working in education, but I think as a kid, I always didn't want to do the K through 12 system. Higher education was more of an interest for me. So when I moved to Tampa and got married, and it was really interesting how the Lord works things out. My ex-wife now had just bought a condominium right and literally at USF. It was right down the street on 42nd Street. So I decided to find employment at USF, and I did. It was a advisor to the minority students, and they were looking for someone full-time who had a real extensive background like me in student organizations and done a number of things at the university in a university experience. And I had done that as a student, at UF, because I did everything from savant leadership, student government. I sang in several choirs, a men's glee club. I performed in the marching band. I was involved in fraternity. And of course, those are some of the highlights I had at UF, and then even graduated with and selected into a who's who, with students at American universities and colleges. I was only African American back in 1974 that had that honor at the University of Florida that particular year. So I decided to take the job at USF. I thought it was nice. I was right down the street. My wife at that time was working a pretty good corporate job, and I needed to help her, so I just took whatever I could. And that was exciting to me to work with those young people at USF. I mean, I loved every moment of working with students. Didn't particularly like working with the Greeks that much because they were, always at each other. And I said, what is all this about?
Right.
We're cousins. We're all in this together. First of all, we're African American.
Right.
And so we got to learn and work together as brothers and sisters. So I tried to bring some understanding to that group. And then I left to go to the Urban League, and I decided to come back. Now, when I left the University of South Florida, I was only there, I was less than a year because of the salary. Went to the Urban League to work with Joanna Tokley, and that was a great experience. I worked with the Skills Training Center that we actually established with the IBM program at Hillsborough Community College to get displaced homemakers trained to get great jobs. And even now, some of those people work in city government and a number of other good jobs. So I decided to do that, and I went back to USF in less than a year. They wanted someone who would recruit students. I said, I have not done this, but I sure believe I can get it done. So I used a lot of the non-traditional approaches to recruiting students. And that's where I kind of got very involved in the community because I used churches and community organizations to seek and outreach students to get them interested in the University of South Florida. And I used to tell people that I was singing and preaching the USF story because I really thought it was a great experience. There was something, we had an immunization, I would say, that we could inoculate students with that made the difference in terms of how they soared and fared as students academically at USF. I'm talking about kids who came from abject poverty. But it was something we instilled in them to make them feel they could run and move the world. And many of them are doing phenomenal things now. They have doctorates, JDs, MDs, and they weren't all 4.0 students who came to USF. Clinton Paris is one, for example, who finished law. I wrote a letter for him to go to law school, and he did extremely well. They even thanked me just from Stetson for recommending him to Stetson Law School. But we got some who came, a little fellow from my hometown, I use that example, whose family was real low income. But he was a student, and he promised me, he said, if you give me a scholarship, I will make this worth your while. Came to USF, and I tell you, he did so well that he interviewed at Harvard, the University of Miami, Johns Hopkins, whatever. And he chose to go to the University of Florida because he didn't want to be that far from his mother. But I was so excited about him that I was able to get him a little additional monies while he was at school at USF. And then when he was getting ready to graduate, I said to our media relations office, this is a story that we must print. I had no idea they were going to send it to the local newspaper. I think it was the Tampa Bay Times or St. Pete Times or whatever during that time. They sent their reporter to Boynton Beach to talk to his family and others who knew him and came up with a 2-page story in the newspaper.
Oh, wow.
And then he went on to the University of Florida to medical school, and when he was getting ready to graduate, I spoke back with the same reporter, and he had doubts that the kid would graduate medical school. I said, this fella he was in our church when I was a member of Earl Mason, Bible-based fellowship Tributaries. I said, this fella's a born-again believer. He is going to get through this. So yes, he's OGBYN. I didn't realize he had started his career because he started with Pfizer, and there were some issues with the young lady had married and her ex-husband, and they created problems with getting them in California. But he had moved the family there, and he had to relocate back to Florida. But when I called him, I said, I'm just thinking about you. I just want to know how you're doing. He said, Dr. Wright, I appreciate you calling me, but I'm getting ready to go into surgery. He was in Oklahoma.
So he's doing all right.
On an Indian reservation, but he is doing extremely well. That kid alone just was enough to make me say, God is able to do all things when you can see young people come from those kind of humble beginnings and end up the way this young man has done. And he has a wife now, and I think 3 kids, but he's doing well. But so those are some of the things, some of the highlights I had at USF.
Tell me about the festival.
Oh, the Tampa Bay Black Heritage Festival. Well, the festival's history is a little interesting. While I was at USF, of course, I worked very closely with the Institute on Black Life. That was Jewel Smith, Dr. Jewel Smith. And so she had been to Africa on a number of occasions, and she said to me, I want to take you back, but I want you to be an advisor to an African-American student group here on campus. So yes, I was a doctoral student at the time, and she made it possible. The university paid my expenses, and I went to Dakar, Senegal, West Africa.
Oh, wow.
I could not believe that I was on my way to Africa. My parents were so excited.
Right.
My parents and my sisters all came to see me off to the airport in Tampa. Our child is going way to Africa.
Yeah.
But listen, after I saw what I experienced, and what really moved me, and I still have goosebumps on me when I talk about the experience, I got on a ferry with Dr. John Smith and other students who went. He took us to Gore Island, to the slave house, which was the main deportation of slaves during that time. And just to see, when I left the slave house and those holding cells and went to the museum to see how our people were sardine in those boats coming across the transatlantic, I said to myself, the average kid in Tampa will never experience this.
Everybody who goes to Africa and sees those holding cells says the same thing you just said.
Oh, my God.
They get immediate goosebumps.
They do. And I didn't do any crying, but I said to myself, the average Joe Blow would never know that we survived all of that. They need to know that we have the DNA and we are a rich history, strong people. So I said to them, I came back, I had gone to a few meetings, and Black people at that time were very discontent about what was happening in the community. We had lost the Melu Festival. We had lost the Florida Classic, the FAMU, Bethune-Cookman, and they were really disgruntled. I think I had gone to a meeting at the Open Cafe. It was owned by the state beautician group, and my ex-wife's mother still is living now, but she was a member, officer of the state beautician organization. And so I was in that meeting that night, and I said to myself, we got to do something here in this community. So I was doing some thinking about that, and after I got involved with the Visit Tampa Bay, which is a convention and visitors bureau.
We had Sherry Brown on here a couple
yes,
weeks ago.
I see that. And then I stopped, and when we were in a meeting, they were talking about bringing travelers to Tampa, Black travelers. And so I asked the question, why? We've lost a lot of things that were very important to us here. So we need to do something in this community. And that is when I called Paul Cato and a few board members together and said, I want to talk about what we can do. And they allowed me to invite 25 to 30 Black business owners to the table. And that's what gave birth to the Tampa Bay Black
And that festival now is, I mean, you got to be proud of it.
Yeah,
Listen, wow.
Every time I go there, I just sit back and I say, the Lord allowed all of this to manifest, but it was just a real vision and the kind of demeanor that we got to get this done. You know, let me say this. That festival meant more to me than getting an increase in pay at the University of South Florida. At that time, my salary was meager, and it was still meager when I left. But I refused to take a job at USF that would not allow me to continue to get that festival off the ground, because we had decided to plan that festival. And so they decided to give me a position as an associate dean. I told them then, I said, if I can't continue to plan this festival, I will not take this increase in pay. They say, take that festival and do what you need to do with it to get it off the ground.
We get into the end, but I want to ask you, as someone who started that festival and understands what it means in terms of history and us knowing our history, this critical race theory stuff that's going around now, you got to feel personally offended by that.
Oh, absolutely.
It's got to speak directly to your legacy.
Oh, absolutely. And so when
to not learn about those holding cells in Senegal.
Yeah, because like I said to people, you can't talk about some of history and pseudo history. You got to tell the truth about what really transpired. And so it is offending all of us, particularly, and even CRT is really not a K through 12 issue.
I didn't know what it was.
It's primarily a higher education initiative.
Yep.
That one of the I forget the person who came up with that premise, but the issue is number of people have written books. I have cousins. I don't know if you met. You know them because you know Representative State Senator Randy Racy. Yeah. His mother, LaVon, just wrote a book, Tough Little Cookie, or something like that. She wrote about her experience of integrating Gainesville High School. Even books like that now, they would not even embrace because they want us to tell half of the story. So, I don't know where we're going to move.
If you believe telling history as it is un-American, that's your problem.
That's right.
It ain't history's problem.
But we have to tell the truth.
That's your problem.
And I don't think nobody's ever said anything to teach hate. I mean, that's not what we're doing. We just want to educate the masses. I wanted to do that even with the festival. I said to myself, we have integrated and interracial families and all. We need to educate people about our history. Because a lot of our people don't know about their history. So that was the main intent, is making sure we educate people. But Lord, this CRT, I hope it will be a slap in the face to those folk who are saying something about it, because we have to tell the truth.
You got to tell the whole thing. Dr. Wright, this was great, brother. I appreciate it. I don't even want to stop it now because I loved where it was going. But thank you for joining. I want you back so we can delve into some of these other things. But your story and your upbringing, particularly the Boynton Beach politics stuff and the festival, man, I didn't know all that. I appreciate it. We've been, you here in Tampa and you're around people, you don't know all that stuff. That's why I like to have these things, man. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, brother. Thank you. Karly Christine, thank you for joining us this afternoon on Vanguards of Democracy. We're going to talk about some personal injury stuff, so I appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
Of course, thank you. So we talk a lot about car accidents. That's what you see the ads for. That's what you see billboards for a lot of times. But a lot of the cases we deal with cover all types of injuries and all types of scenarios. What types of injuries, other than car accidents, should people be kind of worried about, interested in, paying attention to? We all know, any of us that watch TV know what we ought to be paying attention to in the car accidents. But what are some other accidents that crop up a lot of times in these sorts of areas of law that we practice?
Yeah, injuries can arise in all avenues or arenas. You could be just shopping at the grocery store and slip and fall. That's an example. If you slip and fall or trip and fall, you could be over at someone's house and, they may keep a wild animal and you may get injured by that wild animal. And turns out they're strictly liable for that. There is an example. Another thing is a boating accident. Sometimes we call them wake cases where, you may be a passenger on a boat. The driver may not take the wake properly and you get injured as a result. All of those are outside of car accidents, but result in personal injuries. And then, of course, you have your work injuries, which can be considered workers' compensation. And you have your medical malpractice injuries, where your doctor did something under the standard of care, resulting in an injury to you.
Somewhat selfishly, I want to concentrate on the boat wake stuff that you just said, right? Because everybody that watches this podcast know that I have a boat. Tell me, if I have a passenger and I do something that causes that passenger to be injured, clearly I could be liable. But take me through maybe the standard of how bad I would have to mess up before that gets implicated.
Well, it's interesting, and I'll be the first to say with the disclaimer, I'm not a maritime lawyer. You would need to definitely hire a maritime lawyer, because when it comes to an injury on the water, you've got maritime law, admiralty law, and the law of the sea, which are all three separate laws at play. So I am a personal injury lawyer. I am familiar with them, but I am not a maritime lawyer. So you need someone specialized in maritime law. So the answer to your question is it depends where in the water it happened. Right?
Right.
What happened? But the best example I can give you are people who say are a member of a boat club. Okay. They rent a boat, the members take out their friends, and the driver of the boat maybe wasn't trained properly, what have you. They're in the channel. They don't take a wake properly, and it can cause compression fractures. That's, you have two competing forces. When the boat hits a wake, the passenger, say up on the bow, is going to separate from the boat. When the boat comes back down and hits the water, and then that passenger comes back down and hits the boat, you've got the competing forces. That can result in a compression fracture very often. And so as far as how much compensation is available, it depends on the insurance, the value of the vessel, where in the water it occurred, who was hurt, and how.
I appreciate that answer, all the parts of that. You're telling me that I need to draft a waiver before anyone gets on my boat. I gotcha. That is my takeaway from that.
Well, you know what? There's also something called a limitation of liability that can be filed, which limits the value to the value of your vessel. So there's different, the law of maritime law is very friendly to boat owners in that regard, because historically it's very old, and they wanted, ship owners to be able to take the goods and have people work on their ships without being sued by every person who, may have been injured on their boat. So there is something called a limitation of liability that can be filed, which limits your liability to the value of your vessel. So maybe next time you think about upgrading that boat, think twice.
I hear you. I hear you. Now I'm scared to death of my boat. But let me ask you, because I get calls about this sometimes, and it's about medical negligence. And maybe walk through a common scenario that involves medical malpractice. I'm sorry, malpractice is what I meant to say. Walk through a common scenario of malpractice and how that would arise.
Yeah, it's actually not all that common, believe it or not. It takes quite a bit to arise to the level of malpractice. So doctors can make mistakes, okay? To rise to the level of malpractice is a pretty high standard. All right. And so, for instance, an example I can give you is a woman is having a surgery, delivering a baby, and it turns out there's a cyst, and that cyst ruptures. They're not expecting that throughout in the C-section. Okay. And so they're shoving some sponges in there to help stop the fluid, and they forget to count the sponges, and they leave a sponge in there. Okay, that's malpractice, right? What happens is, in that particular case, which I worked on, it took a year for it to figure out that the sponge was still in there. It did a lot of damage. So that rises to the level of malpractice, right? You're not completing medical care to the standard of care, reasonable standard of care. You're doing something under the standard of care. In this particular case, we had to comb through thousands of medical records to find the missing sponge count, where the nurse had failed to note the sponge count upon removal. That was where the medical malpractice arguably arose. But just leaving a sponge in somebody doesn't necessarily arise to malpractice. So there has to be something egregious, operating on the wrong limb, something like that.
That's what I wanted to get to. Like, I know it's a tough question, but do you have an example of something that's not malpractice, but is unfortunate? Something that, everything that happens isn't malpractice, but that's a hard question, but if you have an example, that might be helpful.
I do. Sometimes, say, a failed, quote unquote, a failed surgery doesn't necessarily mean the doctor committed malpractice. Just because the surgery didn't work doesn't mean there's malpractice there. And that can happen, right? Especially in back surgeries, knee surgeries, hip surgeries. Sometimes the doctor's surgery fails and they have to go back in and do another surgery. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it rises to the level of malpractice.
Good. That's perfect. I appreciate that. We've been talking a lot about the physical manifestation of injuries here. There's another component to this. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the other types of injuries that may occur and whether those are compensable?
Sure. Yeah, obviously, physical injuries occur in your common car accident case. Those are the obvious ones you can see, whether there's a scar, disfigurement, a disability of some kind. But truly, when you are physically injured, there are other injuries that manifest, including mental, emotional, professional, right? So those are the kind of things that you have to consider because, for example, if you're in chronic pain, chances are you're going to suffer some type of depression, okay, which definitely is going to affect your mental and emotional stability, which then may affect your career or it may affect your personal relationships. So your whole life essentially is affected. Maybe you suffer a mild traumatic brain injury. And at that point, you are mentally and emotionally affected because your brain is not healthy. It's not as healthy as it was. It's injured. And so you're operating with less reserves. So injuries can be emotional, mental, professional, and also physical.
I appreciate that. Let me ask, because certainly this happens a lot, whether it's a car accident or any type of injury. Talk about the scenario, if you can, where an injury may impact a pre-existing problem that you already have. It may make that problem worse, and talk about how the law tries to differentiate between pre-existing and what happened in the accident.
Well, I'm so glad you asked me that question because the reality of it is this is the majority of people, right? This is the majority of people who are in an automobile crash or some other type of injury action where, listen, chances are you've had some type of prior neck pain, some type of prior back pain. We're all human, right? And so it's critical that you hire an attorney right away when you have any sort of pre-existing issue, because otherwise what'll happen is the defense wants to throw your case into the discount bin. Okay, they don't think you deserve maximum justice. They think that, well, this was all pre-existing and they're going to blame it on whatever that pre-existing thing was. They're not going to take responsibility. They're going to diminish your pain and they're not going to compensate you for it. And so, it's very, very important that when you have a pre-existing condition that you hire an attorney right away, because think about it, when there's less to start with, right? You've already got an injured back or an injured neck, then there is less, the net effect of taking is worse. You have less reserve. So when someone injures you and you've already got a neck injury, it's that much worse because you cannot heal like someone who didn't have any pre-existing neck injuries or back injuries. And the law allows for this. The law says that no matter if you are as delicate as an eggshell, that's what we call the eggshell plaintiff, that you are entitled to maximum justice, the full extent of your damages, regardless if your pre-existing injury was aggravated or not. Now, that comes down to medical documentation and proof, which again, very important to have an attorney, because if you do not get the right medical treatment or the right medical documentation in order to show the differences of what you're experiencing, the jury may decide to limit your damages because they are offered a jury instruction that if they can determine what was aggravated, then they can limit the damages to that, versus if they cannot determine what was aggravated versus what was pre-existing, then they are to award the full extent of the damages. And that, as a lawyer, is what we strive to do, because we understand that if you treated 6 years ago for a shoulder injury that you haven't treated for since, we're not going to let them put that on you. And we're going to get you to the right doctor and the right specialist with the right documentation to show that this not only was an aggravation, but that the jury is not going to be able to tell the difference. In fact, they are going to be able to see that it was the crash that caused this shoulder to be symptomatic because it wasn't 6 years prior.
I mean, some of the biggest fights we have is in this space right here, about they ask for medical records so that they can see when's the last time you went to the doctor for anything having to do with anything in your body. And they, it's just, these are where huge fights take place. But you mentioned something and it's super important, and it's about treatment. Can a person still have a personal injury claim if they initially refuse or fail to seek medical treatment at the time? And even if they can, just talk about how early you ought to get it and all that and that stuff.
Sure. Yes, you can still have a claim if you don't treat it right away, but there's going to be some hurdles to overcome. And first and foremost, you're going to lose your PIP benefits. So if you do not treat within 14 days of an automobile accident, you do not get your personal injury protection benefits, which entitle you to $10,000 worth of medical payments for any injuries related to the crash. And so you've already paid for it. You want that. So if you do not treat within 14 days, you lose that. So it's important to get seen right away so that your injuries get documented and so that you qualify for your full PIP benefits. And furthermore, if you do not treat right away, this can create causation issues. Okay, part of proving your personal injury claim is that the crash or the event, whatever it was, caused your injury. Now, it seems very cut and dry to most people, but it is not. Here's an example. If you get in an automobile crash and you decide, well, I just don't have time to get to the doctor, and you wait a month, there is that month that the defense can then create doubt as to what could have caused your injury, because there is no documentation within that month. And what happens if, let's say, you were in a sailing accident within that month or something else happened? Now they have something else to point to, and we don't have any documentation showing what acute injuries were caused by the crash versus some other superseding event. And the longer that gap lasts, the harder the causation arguments become. And so it becomes very challenging to prove your case, okay? Because at that point, there is doubt as to whether or not the crash caused your injury.
If I get in a car accident and I don't think I'm hurt, what do I do? Because we
go to your urgent care.
Bingo.
Anyway, to make sure, because here's why. You're not a doctor, you're not a specialist, and you need to qualify for your PIP benefits, which is all you got to do is show up and get checked out, okay, within 14 days. So I tell everybody, even if you don't think that you're hurt, go get checked out by a medical doctor, by a professional, by someone you trust. Call a lawyer. It's free, because at the end of the day, you don't know. And wouldn't it be better to have the peace of mind knowing that you are fine, that a doctor has examined you and said, nope, you're good? Because injuries can manifest at later times. Your adrenaline is pumping right after a crash. You are not in the best position to assess that, with all due respect.
Right. And nothing is a problem if you go get treated and they don't find anything. You're not hurting anything, but you can sure hurt your case if you don't get treated and something manifests itself later on down the road. A lot of soft tissue and things can happen, and then all of a sudden 10 days later, you're like, oh my God, I can't walk, and you haven't been treated yet. You've got a problem. So that's exactly what I wanted to get to. And while we're on that track, brain injuries, which sometimes are not readily apparent and sometimes don't manifest themselves until sometime after the initial injury. Are you still able to go to court and get recovery in the case of maybe a brain injury that didn't manifest itself until much later?
Again, the answer to that is your typical, it depends. We hope so, right? As plaintiffs' lawyers, we will fight for our clients, especially the traumatic brain injured, because, again, they are not in a position to evaluate how injured they are. They are doing the best that they can with limited reserves, okay? And so the reality of it is, though, is that we are somewhat bound by something called a statute of limitations. So what that means is you only have a certain amount of time to bring forward a claim. Otherwise, it is expired. So you want to make sure that you contact an attorney right away. Even if you don't think you're injured, or if you haven't been diagnosed with a brain injury, because the attorney not only knows what to look for, but also can help advise you as to how long you have to bring a claim.
Karly, I appreciate it. This was great. My takeaways are certainly I need to get into the maritime law to figure out who can come on my boat and what I make them sign and what can occur. But I think the best advice you gave to the layperson is certainly get yourself checked out and make sure just be safe and get a lawyer to help you through this process. As you said, for plaintiff lawyers, it's free. We don't get paid unless we get some kind of recovery. So call a lawyer and help have them help you walk through this process. This is great. Any final bits of advice?
I just wanted to remind everybody that call a lawyer. Main reason is the insurance companies have their own lawyers on the case right from the start. They're not hesitating. So you got to level the playing field. And it's very important that you do that. The defense loves to dispute liability. They love to blame other people. They love to blame the plaintiff. And they like to say that the plaintiff is not seriously hurt and belittle their pain. So don't fall into that trap. Don't think it's something that you can handle yourself. Even a small automobile accident can turn into a huge litigation case.
And don't feel guilty about accessing the benefits that you paid for under an insurance policy. I can't tell you how many clients I've had who feel guilty by even making a claim because they've been conditioned that anyone who makes an insurance claim is doing something bad. You've been paying these benefits and these premiums all this time for this very moment when you need it. Take advantage of it. It's yours.
You need it. Let me give you an example real quick. I've got a client who has never made a claim. She's in her 60s, and she figured out how much she has paid in a certain insurance company who she's had her whole life in premiums, and it was over $400,000. She has a minimal $50,000 policy that they will not pay. She has paid them over $400,000, never made a claim.
That's why you got to call a lawyer. Karly, I appreciate it. Thank you for joining us. we'll have you back on next time, and next time we hope that you will give me some maritime advice, but I'll give you time.
Thanks, John. I'll be honest, I got to do a little bit more research. It's something that I'm super interested in. There's only about 50 lawyers around the state that truly specialize in it.
Right.
So it's very niched, very interesting area, and I'm there with you. So be safe out there, and thanks so much for having me.
No, I appreciate you being on. Thank you. Appreciate it. Vanguards of Democracy is funded and produced by Vanguard Attorneys, a local personal injury law firm serving the Tampa Bay area with ingenuity and an indomitable work ethic. Don't forget to follow Vanguards of Democracy on YouTube or download episodes on your favorite podcast streaming services like iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And lastly, we're excited to announce that we're launching our new landing page, www.vanguardsofdemocracy.com, where you'll be able to ask questions, recommend guests or topics, and stay up to date with news and announcements. It'll be great. If you know how to bookmark a website, this is the one that'll make it worth it. Thank you.